"You sure you're allowed to be here, Grandpa?" The voice was young, sharp, with the casual arrogance of someone who had never known a world without jets. It sliced through the peaceful drone of the afternoon on the historic flight line. Randall Hughes, 84 years old, didn't flinch. His hands, though wrinkled and mapped with liver spots, were steady as he meticulously cleaned the cowling of a Pratt & Whitney R1820 Cyclone engine. He ran a clean rag over the metal, his touch gentle, reverent. Before him, looming like a ghost from a bygone era, sat the shell of a B-17 Flying Fortress. A second voice joined the first, belonging to a staff sergeant with a swaggering walk and a name tape that read Gallo. "Seriously, Pop, this area is for authorized personnel only. This isn't a retirement home playground." Randall finally looked up. His eyes, the color of a faded sky, held a placid depth that seemed to absorb their taunts without disturbance. He wore simple red overalls over a faded white shirt, the kind of clothes that had seen decades of honest work. He said nothing, simply turned his attention back to the engine. His silence was a wall they seemed determined to breach. The young airmen, a small group of 3 from the maintenance crew on the far side of the field, had wandered over during their break. They were used to working on sleek gray F-22s and massive C-5 Galaxies, machines of quiet, deadly efficiency. This hulking metallic relic was a joke to them, and the old man tending to it was the punchline. "What do you even think you're doing?" Gallo asked, stepping closer. He kicked one of the massive tires, the rubber thick and cracked with age. The dull thud echoed in the quiet. "Think you're gonna get this rust bucket flying with a wrench and a prayer?" His 2 companions snickered. They circled the aircraft, their modern sand-colored boots scuffing the sun-baked tarmac. They pointed at the faded nose art, a barely visible painting of a determined-looking woman with the words "Endless Misery" painted in peeling script beneath her. "Endless misery," one of them read aloud, laughing. "Sounds about right. It's miserable just looking at it." Randall's jaw tightened, a barely perceptible ripple along his weathered skin. He continued his work, his movements economical and precise. He picked up a wrench, his knuckles white as he found the perfect purchase on a rusted bolt. To them, he was a stubborn old fool. To him, this was a sacred duty. Each bolt tightened, each patch of corrosion removed, was a prayer for the boys who had called this plane home. He wasn't restoring a machine, he was resurrecting a memory. Gallo, annoyed by the lack of reaction, stepped directly into Randall's path, blocking his access to the engine. "I'm talking to you. I need to see your authorization, your base pass, your ID. Who let you out here?" Randall slowly set his wrench down on a nearby crate. He reached into the pocket of his overalls and pulled out a worn leather wallet, the kind that folded over on itself and was held together more by habit than stitching. He fumbled with it for a moment, his fingers not as nimble as they once were. The airmen exchanged impatient glances. The sun was hot, beating down on the concrete, and their break was almost over. This was no longer fun, it was becoming an annoyance. "Come on, old-timer, we haven't got all day." Gallo pressed, his voice losing its mocking tone and taking on a harder, more authoritative edge. He was a staff sergeant, after all. He had stripes on his arm and authority to wield, especially over a confused civilian. Randall finally produced a laminated card. It was a base pass, issued by the Community Relations Office, granting him access to the historic flight line. It was faded but perfectly valid. Gallo snatched it from his hand. He squinted at the photo, then at Randall's face. "Randall Hughes." "Well, Mr. Hughes, this just says you can be here. It doesn't say you can play mechanic on government property. This aircraft is a museum piece. You can't just start taking it apart." "I have permission," Randall said, his voice raspy, unused to conflict. "From the base commander." Gallo let out a short, incredulous laugh. "The base commander, Colonel Evans. You have his personal permission to tinker with a multi-million-dollar historical asset." "Sure you do. And I'm the next chief of staff of the Air Force." He handed the ID back with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Look, I don't know what story you spun to get this pass, but your little adventure is over. You're a liability. What if you fell off that wing? What if you started a fire? It's time for you to go." Randall stood his ground, his gaze drifting back to the engine. "I'm not finished." "Oh, I think you are," Gallo said, stepping closer. His shadow fell over Randall. "We're going to escort you off this flight line, now." He noticed a small sewn patch on Randall's old, cracked leather jacket that was draped over the crate. It was dark blue with a silver-winged bullet at its center. It was so faded and frayed it was barely recognizable. Gallo reached out and flicked it with his finger. "What's this supposed to be? Some kind of biker patch?" The touch, the casual, dismissive flick against the patch, was what did it. The world around Randall seemed to warp and shimmer, the hot air of the tarmac replaced by the biting, freezing wind of high altitude. The jeering voice of the airman melted into the crackle of a radio, the roar of the Cyclone engines replaced by the deafening percussion of flak shells exploding all around the fuselage. He wasn't on a sunny airfield anymore. He was 25,000 feet over Germany, crammed into the waist gunner position of the original Endless Misery. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and fear. A young man across from him, a boy from Ohio named Danny with a picture of his sweetheart taped to his machine gun, gave him a terrified thumbs up. Then the world outside the window turned into a storm of shrapnel and smoke. The patch on his jacket, then brand new, felt heavy on his chest, a small shield against a sky full of metal. The memory vanished as quickly as it came, leaving an ache in Randall's chest that had nothing to do with his age. He looked at the young sergeant's smug face and saw a ghost of the ignorance that had filled the world with so much noise and fire. About 50 yards away, standing in the cavernous shadow of a maintenance hangar, a civilian logistics contractor named Mark had been watching the scene unfold. He'd seen the airmen swagger over and had initially thought nothing of it, but their posture, their laughter, and the old man's resolute stillness had set his teeth on edge. He knew who the old man was, at least by name. Mr. Hughes, the quiet gentleman who had been given permission to work on the old bomber, a project everyone on base knew about even if they didn't understand it. When he saw Gallo snatch the ID and then flick the patch on the old jacket, Mark felt a cold knot of anger form in his stomach. He'd spent 6 years in the Air Force himself before taking a civilian job. He knew the look of a bully high on a little bit of rank. And when Gallo put his hand on Randall's shoulder, as if to physically force him away, Mark knew he had to act. Calling security forces would just create a bigger mess. It would be the sergeant's word against a civilian's. He needed to go higher. Pulling out his phone, his fingers flew across the screen. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the one he was looking for, the direct line to the base commander's administrative office. He knew it was a long shot, but he had to try. The phone was answered on the second ring. Colonel Evans' office, Airman Davis speaking. "Airman, this is Mark Stetler from Logistics," Mark said, his voice low and urgent. He kept his eyes fixed on the confrontation across the tarmac. "I need to report a situation on the historic flight line. Some maintenance personnel are harassing Mr. Hughes, the civilian working on the B-17 restoration." There was a pause. "Harassing, sir?" "Yes. It's Staff Sergeant Gallo and a couple of his guys. They're being disrespectful, and it looks like it's about to get physical. They're treating him like a trespasser, and I think they're about to try and remove him from the base." Mark could hear the faint sound of typing on the other end. "Mr. Randall Hughes?" Airman Davis asked, a new note of concern in her voice. "That's him," Mark confirmed. "Look, I don't want to cause trouble, but this feels wrong. The old man is just trying to work, and these kids are treating him like dirt." "Understood, Mr. Stetler. Please stand by. The colonel needs to know about this immediately." Mark let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Help was on the way. He just hoped it would get there in time. Inside the sprawling headquarters building, Colonel David Evans was in the middle of a budget meeting that was making his teeth ache with boredom. He was a tall man in his late 40s, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and a demeanor to match. He commanded the entire wing, a responsibility that left little room for frivolity. His door opened just enough for his executive aide, Airman Davis, to stick her head in. She had a rule about never interrupting these meetings, so her presence meant something was wrong. "Sir," she whispered, her eyes wide, "I apologize for the interruption, but I have an urgent message from the flight line." Colonel Evans excused himself from the meeting, his annoyance plain. He stepped into his outer office, closing the door behind him. "This had better be important, Airman." "Sir, it's a call from a civilian contractor. He says some of the maintenance crew are harassing Mr. Hughes." The name hit the air and seemed to change its composition. Every trace of annoyance vanished from the colonel's face, replaced by a sudden cold intensity. The air in the room became still and heavy. "Randall Hughes?" the colonel asked, his voice a low growl. "On the B-17? "Yes, sir. Staff Sergeant Gallo's team. The contractor says they're threatening to remove him from the flight line." Colonel Evans stared at his aide for a long second, his mind working furiously. Then he moved with a speed that was startling in a man his size. He strode to his desk and jabbed the intercom button. "Get my vehicle to the front door." "Now," he barked. He then grabbed his desk phone. "Get me Wing Chief Master Sergeant Thompson. Tell him to meet me at the historic flight line 5 minutes ago. Tell him it's about Randall Hughes." He slammed the phone down. He looked at his desk, at a framed photo of his own grandfather in an Army Air Forces uniform, standing proudly in front of a B-17. On his bookshelf there was a worn, leather-bound history of the 8th Air Force. He grabbed the book, a specific page dog-eared, and stormed out of the office, leaving his aide and the budget meeting completely forgotten. The audience in his office was confused, but the audience watching this unfold knew one thing for certain: the cavalry was coming, and they were riding a storm. Back on the tarmac, Gallo's patience had run out. The old man's quiet defiance was an insult to his rank, to his very uniform. He had given him a direct order, and it had been ignored. "All right, that's it," Gallo said, his voice hard as stone. He took a step forward and placed his hand firmly on Randall's arm. The old man's arm was thin, but the muscle beneath the skin was like coiled wire. "Party's over, old man. You and me were taking a walk to the security forces building. They can figure out which nursing home you escaped from. We'll have them run a psych eval while they're at it." The threat was the ultimate humiliation, to question not just his presence but his sanity, to reduce a lifetime of experience and memory to the ramblings of a senile old fool. Randall looked down at the sergeant's hand on his arm and then back up at his face. For the first time, a flicker of profound sadness crossed his features. It was not fear, it was pity. Just as Gallo began to pull him away, a sound tore through the air, the high-pitched squeal of tires on hot asphalt. A black staff car, the kind reserved for senior command, swerved onto the access road and skidded to a halt just yards away, kicking up a cloud of dust. The colonel's eagle insignia gleamed on the bumper. Before it had even stopped rocking, the passenger door flew open and Colonel Evans emerged, his face a mask of thunder. From the other side, the Wing Chief Master Sergeant, a man whose presence alone was enough to make most airmen stand straighter, got out. He looked just as furious. The mocking smiles on the faces of Gallo's friends dissolved into slack-jawed panic. They snapped to a clumsy version of attention. Gallo froze, his hand still on Randall's arm. He felt a wave of cold dread wash over him, so intense it was almost nauseating. He had made a mistake, a terrible, career-ending mistake. Colonel Evans marched across the tarmac, his boots crunching on the gravel with menacing purpose. He didn't even glance at the terrified airmen. His eyes, burning with an intensity Gallo had never seen before, were locked on one person, Randall Hughes. He came to a stop 3 feet in front of the old man. He took in the entire scene in a single sweeping gaze, Gallo's hand on Randall's arm, the fear on the young men's faces, and Randall's own quiet, unshakable dignity. Then, in a move that shattered the reality of every person watching, Colonel David Evans, commander of the entire wing, snapped his body into the sharpest, most pristine position of attention he could muster. His back was ramrod straight, his chin tucked, his eyes forward. He raised his right hand in a salute so precise, so full of reverence, it seemed to cut the air. "Mr. Hughes," the colonel's voice boomed, clear and powerful, echoing across the flight line. "It is an honor to have you on my base, sir." Behind him, the Wing Chief Master Sergeant did the same, his own salute a mirror of his commander's. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant scream of a jet engine. Gallo and his men stood frozen, their minds unable to process what was happening. They were in a nightmare. Holding his salute, the colonel slowly turned his head, his fiery gaze falling upon the petrified staff sergeant. "Do you have any idea," he said, his voice dangerously low, "who you are speaking to?" He didn't wait for an answer. He didn't need one. He turned his attention back to Randall, but his words were for the benefit of the ignorant. "Sergeant Gallo, you and your men are standing in the presence of Gunnery Sergeant Randall Hughes of the United States Army Air Forces. This man flew 35 combat missions over Europe in an aircraft just like this one when he was barely 20 years old. He flew through skies so thick with flak you could walk on it, in temperatures that would freeze a man solid, to fight an enemy that you have only read about in history books." The colonel took a breath, his voice rising with controlled fury. On his 27th mission, while flying in the endless misery, his B-17 took a direct hit from an 88mm shell. It blew out the number 2 engine and depressurized the cabin. With his pilot fighting for control and his oxygen lines severed, Sergeant Hughes, manning a waist gun, single-handedly fought off an attack from 3 Messerschmitt 109s for 12 minutes. His actions allowed his crippled bomber to make it back to England, saving the lives of the 9 other men on board. For that action, he was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry. He gestured with his head toward Randall's worn jacket. "The patch you so casually dismissed is his combat aircrew wings. He also holds 2 distinguished flying crosses, 4 air medals, and a Purple Heart for wounds he received from shrapnel on his final mission. This man is not a hobbyist. He is not a confused old man. He is a living legend. He is the reason you get to wear that uniform in a time of peace." The story hung in the air, immense and humbling. The crowd that had begun to gather at a distance stood in stunned, reverent silence. Mark Stettler, watching from the hangar, felt a tear trace a path down his cheek. The young airmen looked ashen, their arrogance replaced by a profound and soul-crushing shame. They weren't just wrong. They had committed a sacrilege. Colonel Evans finally lowered his salute, but he kept his eyes on Randall. He then turned his full, undivided attention to Gallo. The force of his glare was a physical thing. "You are a disgrace to that uniform, Sergeant," he said, his voice quiet but carrying more weight than a shout. "You see an old man, and you show contempt. I see a giant, on whose shoulders every single one of us stands. You saw a piece of junk. He sees his family. Your profound lack of respect, curiosity, and humility is an embarrassment to this command and to the entire United States Air Force. You and your men will report to my office at 1600 hours. Be prepared to explain to me why I shouldn't strip you of your rank on the spot. Now get out of my sight." They practically scrambled away, not daring to look back, their humiliation complete. The colonel's face softened as he turned back to Randall. "Sir, on behalf of everyone here, I am deeply, truly sorry for the disrespect you were shown." Randall looked at the powerful officer before him, then at the half-restored engine of his beloved plane. He finally spoke, his voice not angry but weary and filled with a timeless wisdom. "They're just kids, Colonel," he said, his voice raspy. "They see the metal. They see the rust. I see Danny, the other gunner, who never made it home from the 36th mission. I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing it so someone remembers them, so they don't just disappear." As he spoke, the world flickered again. He was 20 years old, standing in a muddy field in England. The air smelled of rain and engine oil. A two-star general with weary eyes was pinning the silver combat wings on his chest. The general's voice was low, meant for him alone. "You wear this for the men who can't, Sergeant. Don't you ever forget it." And he never had. The fallout from that day was swift and decisive. Sergeant Gallo and his men were formally reprimanded and assigned to a month of grueling base cleanup duties. But Colonel Evans knew that punishment was not the point. Education was. He implemented a new base-wide heritage program. From that day forward, all newly assigned airmen, as part of their in-processing, were required to spend a full day on the historic flight line. Their final lesson of the day was a mandatory session with Mr. Randall Hughes, who would walk them through the B-17, telling them not about the machine but about the men who flew it. The restoration of endless misery became the entire Wings project. Volunteers from every squadron appeared, offering their time and expertise. The base fabrication shop began milling new parts. The project became a symbol of pride, a tangible link between the Air Force of today and the giants of its past. A few weeks later, Randall was on a scaffold, carefully polishing the plexiglass nose cone, when a figure approached below. It was Gallo, out of uniform, wearing simple jeans and a t-shirt. He stood there for a long moment, hands in his pockets, looking up at the old man. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet and hesitant. "Sir." Randall looked down. Gallo held up a perfectly polished torque wrench. "My grandpa was a mechanic on B-29s in the Pacific," he said, not looking Randall in the eye but at the plane. "He taught me a thing or two about radial engines. I was wondering if you could use an extra pair of hands. I'm a fast learner." Randall studied the young man's face, seeing not the arrogant NCO from before, but a humbled kid searching for a way to make things right. A slow, genuine smile creased Randall's lips. He nodded. "All right, son," he said, his voice warm. "Come on up. Let me show you how to properly time the magnetos on a right cyclone." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the tarmac, the two figures, one old and one young, worked side by side, the quiet sounds of their tools a testament to forgiveness and the enduring power of shared purpose. Randall Hughes' story is a powerful reminder that heroes walk among us, often in the quietest of forms. If his story of valor and forgiveness moved you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more stories that honor our nation's finest.